Story 1. It's taken me months to work up the courage to share this, but I have to get it off my chest. I still can't explain what happened to me last summer at my family's lake cabin. Believe me or don't, but I swear every word of this is true. My grandparents built the small cabin on Shadow Lake back in the 1960s. It's rustic, no TV, spotty cell service, a wood-burning stove. The perfect escape. I was up there alone for a week last August, just me and my dog Sadie, enjoying the solitude. On my third night, I stayed up late reading by lamplight. It was after 2 a.m. when Sadie started whining at the door, begging to go out. Odd, since she usually sleeps like a log. I clipped on her leash and we stepped out into the warm summer night. As soon as I shut the door behind us, Sadie froze. Her ears perked up and a low growl rumbled in her throat. She stared intently at a stand of trees near the lake, about 30 yards from the porch. "What is it, girl?" I asked, peering into the darkness. At first I saw nothing. Then in the shadows between the pines, a pale shape shifted. My blood ran cold. It looked like... But no, it couldn't be. The shape moved into a shaft of moonlight and my knees nearly buckled. It had the body of a man, but its limbs were too long, its proportions subtly wrong. And its face. I'll never forget those hollow, fathomless black eyes in that bone-white face. Not human. It couldn't be human. I think I screamed. I must have. The next thing I knew, I was dragging a barking, snarling Sadie back into the cabin, slamming and locking the door. My hands shook violently as I rammed a chair under the doorknob. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, clutching a fireplace poker, jumping at every creak of the old cabin. At first light, I crept outside, Sadie glued to my heels. The woods looked perfectly ordinary in the sunlight. No sign of whatever I had seen, if I had seen anything at all. I almost convinced myself it was just a horrible dream. Almost. But then I noticed something as I turned to go back inside. A single sheet of photo paper lying in the damp grass. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and turned it over. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a black and white photo of my grandfather as a young man, standing on the porch of this very cabin, smiling. But next to him, half in shadow, loomed the unmistakable elongated form with those same terrible dark eyes, unblinking, staring directly at the camera, staring directly at me. My grandfather passed away when I was a baby. There's no way that photo could exist. Yet here I am, holding that weathered, impossible photo in my hands as I type this. I don't know if I'm losing my mind. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know how this is possible. All I know is I'm never setting foot in those woods again. Story 2, I've been debating whether to post this for weeks, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm not sure what I experienced, but it's been haunting me ever since. Believe me or don't, but here's what happened. 3 weeks ago, I was driving back from visiting my parents upstate. It was getting late, close to midnight, and I was on a lonely stretch of highway cutting through dense woods. I hadn't seen another car for miles. I was fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station to keep me awake, when I noticed a weird shimmering in my peripheral vision. I glanced to my left and nearly swerved off the road. Hovering among the trees, maybe 100 feet from the highway, was an enormous thing. I don't know how else to describe it. It was metallic and geometric, like 3 huge silver pyramids pointing different directions fused together at the base. It had to be at least the size of a house, and it was just hanging there silently, a dozen feet above the forest floor. Intricate patterns of lights pulsed across its surface. My foot eased off the gas pedal as I gawked at it. I was so enwrapped that I barely noticed the white glare spilling in from the edges of the windshield until it completely enveloped me. Blazing brightness washed out everything, blanking out the road, the woods, the object, the interior of my car. I slammed on the brakes in panic. When the light receded seconds later, my car was stopped dead in the middle of the highway. The engine had stalled out. I blinked away the dazzling after images and stared out the window in shock. The metal thing was gone. I was in a completely different part of the woods. The trees were further back from the road here, and the dashboard clock now read 12:47. With shaking hands, I restarted the car. It took a minute for the utter wrongness to penetrate my confusion. The last time I had checked the time before the light, it had been just past midnight. Now close to an hour had passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. I spent the rest of the drive home rigid with terror, jumping at every shadow. As soon as I got in, I checked the GPS log on my phone, hoping for some rational explanation, but the map of my route showed a 14-mile gap, a straight line connecting 12:04 a.m. and 12:51 a.m., as if I had teleported down the highway. I reported the incident to the local police the next day, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? But then what about the missing time, the inexplicable jump down the highway? I've scoured the internet for anyone who has seen something similar. The closest thing I found was an obscure blog post from the early 2000s, mentioning highway anomalies and temporal distortions, but without much detail. I tried contacting the author, but the email bounced back. I'm at a loss. I don't know if what I saw was extraterrestrial or something stranger. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, that light or the overwhelming sense that for a moment I brushed against something utterly beyond human comprehension. I'm not sure why I'm posting this. Maybe in the hopes that someone out there has experienced something similar and can help me understand. Or maybe just to get this impossible weight off my chest. Either way, thanks for reading. Story 3, I've never shared this with anyone, not even my wife. But it's been eating at me for months. I need to get it off my chest, even if it's just screaming into the void of the internet. It happened last October. My wife was away on a girls' trip for the weekend, so it was just me and our Labrador Max at home. I remember it was unseasonably cold that night, like winter had come early. I cranked the heat up before bed, even though I usually like it cool when I sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The bedroom was pitch black and utterly, unnaturally silent. I couldn't even hear the whir of the fan or Max's usual soft snoring from his bed in the corner. Fumbling for my phone on the nightstand, I clicked the button to check the time. Nothing. The screen remained black. I started to sit up, planning to fiddle with the phone more, when an icy chill swept over me. It felt like I'd been doused in frigid water. My breath frosted in the air. Shivering, I called out for Max, but no furry head butted my hand. He always came when I called. Unease knotted in my gut as I swung my legs out of bed, hissing as my bare feet hit the gelid floor. I staggered to the light switch, my sleep-clumsy fingers finding it by memory. I flipped it up and down, up and down. Nothing. No power. I stumbled to the window, tugged the curtain open a crack. The whole street was dark. Not a single porch light shone. It was like the entire neighborhood had been swallowed by the night. As I peered out, my sleep-fogged brain finally registered what else was wrong. There was no sound, no distant traffic, no crickets, not even a breath of wind. Then I saw it, a figure standing under the street lamp on the corner. Not standing, I realized, with a sick lurch. Floating, hovering a foot above the pavement, its long, shadowy form swaying slightly as if in an unfelt breeze. As I watched frozen, it rotated slowly until it was facing my window, facing me. Ice flooded my veins. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I could only stare as it glided toward my house, its motion smooth and unnatural. Darkness shrouded its features, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, an almost physical pressure. It halted at the edge of my lawn. Then it raised one long, black limb, beckoned. A high, thin sound splintered the silence, a whine just at the edge of my hearing, needling into my skull. Dizziness swamped me. Bile clawed up my throat. The last thing I remember is the figure flowing toward me, its form boiling and stretching grotesquely. Then the dark rose up and dragged me under. I woke to pale sunlight and Max's cold nose prodding my neck. I was on the floor, wedged halfway under the bed, the room an unholy mess. Max whined, deep and anxious, shoving at me until I uncurled with a groan. I staggered downstairs with him, the events of the night a muzzy jumble. A dream, I told myself, a bizarrely vivid nightmare. Then I saw the front door. The knob hung loose, splintered wood jutting from the frame. 3 long, deep gouges scored the inside of the door, the edges curled and blackened as if seared by some unearthly heat. Max flat out refused to go into the living room. When I flipped on the light, my knees nearly gave out. The furniture was tossed around like a giant child's playthings. Broken lamps, shredded cushions, and the smell, a cloying, burnt sugar reek that clung to the back of my throat. I called the police with some half-assed story about a break-in. They took a report, said they'd look into it. I could tell they thought I'd trashed my own place in a drunk or drug stupor. But I know what I saw, what I felt. The door's been replaced. The living room put back to rights. Max doesn't whimper at the threshold anymore. But the scorched, sweet stink still lingers. And sometimes in the small hours of the night, I jerk awake to a high keening only I seem to hear, and the oily pressure of eyes on me in the dark. Story 4, I've been debating posting this for a while, but after seeing some similar stories here, I figured why not? Throw my weird experience onto the pile, and maybe see if anyone else has insights, because I sure as hell don't. So this happened about 5 years ago, but it's seared into my brain like it was last week. Me and 5 of my college buddies, Ethan, Liam, Caleb, Josh, and Noah, went up to Ethan's family's cabin for a long weekend. It's this picturesque spot nestled in the woods beside Willow Lake, miles from the nearest town. We'd been going there for years, ever since freshman year, our little summer tradition. Anyway, it was our second night there. We'd spent the day swimming, grilling burgers, drinking a few beers, the usual. As the sun set, we built up a bonfire on the beach and settled in with another round of drinks. The night was moonless, the stars a brilliant spray above the black silhouettes of the pines. It was Caleb who saw the lights first. He choked on his beer, sputtering, and pointed wordlessly over the lake. We all turned to look and froze. On the far side of the lake, above the ridge of the hills, 3 glowing orbs hung in the sky. They were too big and too bright to be stars, and they were moving, weaving intricate patterns around each other, looping and swirling in a mesmerizing dance. We sat there, completely entranced, watching this silent aerial ballet. The lights pulsed gently, shifting through shades of amber, pearl, and azure. It was beautiful and eerie in equal measure. My mind flicked through rational explanations. Drones, aircraft, satellites, but none fit. There was something otherworldly about their fluid motion, the utter silence of their passage. I don't know how long we watched. 15 minutes? 20? Time seemed to blur and stretch. It felt like we'd slipped into a trance, hypnotized by those unearthly lights. Then, without warning, a blazing streak split the sky, a meteor, brighter than any I'd ever seen. For a heartbeat, it was like high noon, the beach and hills bleached in stark white light. Our shadows slashed ink black behind us. The spell shattered. Liam let out a yelp, and we were all on our feet, stumbling backwards. I don't remember anyone saying a word, but suddenly we were all moving, scrambling up the slope to the cabin like we had hellhounds on our heels. Inside, we stood in the dark living room, breathing hard, not looking at each other. My heart felt like it was trying to slam its way out of my ribcage. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. I remember Ethan mumbling something about being wiped, and the others muttering agreement. We dispersed to our rooms like zombies, not even bothering to turn on the lights. I collapsed into bed, my mind whirling, and promptly passed out. The next morning was odd. We were all groggy and out of sorts, nursing the mother of all headaches. But no one mentioned the lights, or the meteor. It was like there was this unspoken agreement to just not talk about it. The rest of the trip passed in a haze. We went through the motions of our usual lake activities, but there was this tense undercurrent, this sense that something was off-kilter. We left a day earlier than planned, everyone claiming various excuses. In the years since, I've tried to bring it up a few times, tentatively after a few drinks, but the guys always shut it down, changing the subject with a vehemence that borders on angry, especially Ethan and Josh. It's like they can't or won't acknowledge that night. But it happened. I know it did. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed out there, tried to figure out what we were seeing. And other times I'm glad we fled. because there's this niggling fear in the back of my mind. What if it wasn't just lights we saw? What if something saw us too? I've never been back to Willow Lake. None of us have, as far as I know. And we don't do our summer cabin weekends anymore either. It's like that night severed something, some cord of easy friendship and shared history. I'm not saying it was aliens, or that anything happened to us beyond seeing something we couldn't explain. But I do know that Willow Lake doesn't feel like a haven anymore. It feels like a place where the world wore thin, and I'm in no hurry to peer through that gap again. Story 5. I've never told this story before, not to anyone. Even now, typing it out, my hands are shaking. But after seeing that scene in Beacon Point, it all came flooding back, and I knew I had to get it out. Had to see if anyone else has experienced something like this. So here goes. It was about 6 years ago. Me and a group of college friends, Jay, Alex, Lena, and Sophia, had gone camping for the weekend up in the mountains of North Georgia. We'd found this gorgeous campground beside a lake, secluded and serene, perfect for a getaway from the stress of school and city life. The first day was idyllic. We set up our tents in a little clearing in the woods, swam in the crystal clear lake, hiked the winding trails. As the sun began to set, we built a campfire and settled in for dinner and drinks beneath the emerging stars. But as night fell, so did the weather. Dark clouds rolled in, obscuring the stars, and the air grew heavy with impending rain. We barely made it into our tents before the downpour started, a relentless drumming on the nylon. I was exhausted from the day's activities, and the sound of the rain was soothing. I drifted off quickly, cocooned in my sleeping bag, lulled by the steady patter overhead. I don't know what woke me, some visceral sense of wrongness, a prickle at the nape of my neck. I lay still, listening, trying to discern anything beyond the rain. Then I heard it. Voices, right outside my tent. At first I thought it must be my friends, braving the weather for some reason. But as I strained to make out the words, a chill crept down my spine. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. The voices were low and sibilant, a hushed but fervent conversation that seemed to slither through the night. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding against my ribs. As my fingers closed around it, a glow bloomed outside the tent. 2 distinct lights, one on either side of the entrance. They weren't the stark white of flashlights, but softer, almost opalescent. One was a shimmering blue, the other an eerie green. The voices grew more agitated, rising in pitch and speed, and the lights began to move, circling the tent. They glided smoothly, never wavering, never revealing the source. I couldn't hear any footsteps, any sign of passage through the undergrowth. Just the rain, the voices, and the rustle of the lights brushing against the tent fabric. Terror turned my limbs to lead. I wanted to call out to my friends, but fear stoppered my throat. All I could do was watch, trembling, as the lights completed their circuit once, twice, again and again, faster and faster, the voices keeping pace, building to a fever pitch. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The lights winked out, plunging the tent into darkness. The voices cut off mid-word, leaving only the susurration of the rain. The silence was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there, rigid, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning in the darkness. I kept waiting for something, for the lights to return, for the voices to start again, for the tent flap to unzip and reveal the source of my terror. But there was nothing. Eventually, the adrenaline ebbed, leaving me drained and shaky. I must have dozed off at some point, because I startled awake to sunlight filtering through the tent and the distant chatter of birdsong. For a blissful moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I unzipped the tent with trembling fingers, I knew it hadn't been. The ground around my tent was disturbed, the undergrowth trampled in a perfect circle, and there, caught on a protruding root at the entrance, was a scrap of fabric, iridescent and shimmering, like a shard of opal. It wasn't from any of our tents or gear. I stumbled to my friends' tents, shook them awake, babbling about what had happened. But when we examined the area, the strange fabric was gone, vanished like it had never been. And in the cold light of day, my story sounded flimsy, the ravings of a nightmare-addled mind. I could see the doubt, the concern in their eyes. We left that day, abandoning our plans for a full weekend, and we never spoke of it again. I think they half convinced themselves I'd imagined it or dreamt it. I almost wish I could believe that too, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and now after seeing that movie, I know I'm not alone. Those voices in Beacon Point, they were identical to the ones outside my tent that night, that same eerie, unintelligible whisper. I don't know what they were. Aliens, spirits, something else entirely. All I know is that the woods no longer feel safe to me. There's a veil of mystery there, and that night, something peeked through from the other side. I still camp occasionally, but never deep in the wilderness, and never alone. And I always keep a light on at night, because in the darkness, I can still sometimes hear the ghost of those whispers, and I never want to be in the dark with them again. Story 6. I've carried this memory with me for over 2 decades, a secret burden I've never shared. But reading similar stories here, I feel compelled to add my voice, to finally release this tale into the world, and perhaps find some measure of peace. I was 6 years old, living in a small town in upstate New York. It was a warm summer night, the kind where the air feels heavy and the crickets sing in ceaseless chorus. I was tucked into my bed, my older sister Sarah slumbering in her own bed across the room. I remember waking suddenly, jolted from a dream I can't recall. The room was bathed in a strange, pallid light that seemed to emanate from the window, a light that had no business being there in the dead of night. I tried to turn my head to call out to Sarah, but I couldn't move. It was as if my body had been turned to stone, every muscle locked in place. Even my voice was frozen, trapped behind my teeth. That's when I saw them. They glided through the window, moving with a fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. There were 3 of them, their skin a sickly gray, their limbs long and thin. But it was their heads that sent icy tendrils of terror down my spine. They were enormous, dominated by black, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to swallow the light. Eyes that fixed on me with an intensity that seared into my soul. I screamed, or I tried to. In my mind, I was howling, thrashing, desperate to break free of the paralysis that gripped me. But in reality, I lay as still and silent as a corpse, tears leaking from the corners of my eyes. They surrounded my bed, looming over me. One of them reached out a hand, and I saw that it had too many fingers, long and bone-thin. It touched my face, a touch that burned like ice, and I felt something crack inside my mind, a wall of primal fear and revulsion. I don't know what happened next. The memory fragments, jagged shards that cut when I try to piece them together. I have impressions of light, of motion, of those terrible, depthless eyes, and pain, a sharp, lancing pain that seemed to originate from the core of my being. Then as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The light faded, the room plunging back into darkness, and with the darkness came release. The paralysis shattered, and I found myself sobbing, great, wrenching gasps that shook my small frame. I stumbled out of bed, blind with terror, and half crawled, half ran to my parents' room. I hurled myself into my mother's arms, burying my face in her nightgown, my tears soaking the fabric. I couldn't speak, couldn't form words around the horror lodged in my throat. My parents were alarmed, of course. They tried to soothe me, to coax an explanation from me. But I remained mute, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't articulate. It was a full day before I found my voice again, and even then, I couldn't bring myself to speak of what I had seen. In the weeks that followed, I was a ghost of myself. I refused to sleep in my room, insisted on keeping the lights on at all times. My mother, bless her, was endlessly patient. She held me through the night terrors, whispered comfort in my ear, never pressured me to talk before I was ready. Gradually, the raw edges of the experience dulled. Life went on as it tends to do, but the memory lingered, a dark stain on the fabric of my childhood. It wasn't until I was in college when I first heard about sleep paralysis that I had a name for what I had experienced, a rational explanation for the terrifying impossibility of that night. I devoured every scrap of information I could find, desperate to make sense of my trauma. And it helped, in a way, to know that I wasn't alone, that my experience, while deeply disturbing, was not uncommon, that there was a biological basis for the paralysis, the hallucinations. But even now, with decades and distance and knowledge under my belt, I can't shake the visceral realness of that memory, the texture of their skin, the smell of them, the soul-rending depth of their eyes. In the darkest corners of my mind, a small, scared voice whispers that it was more than a hallucination, that for one terrifying night, the veil between worlds thinned and something crossed over. I've never seen them again. I pray I never will. But the scars remain, invisible but indelible, a reminder that the universe is vaster and stranger than we can comprehend, and that some mysteries once touched never truly leave us. Story 7. I've never told anyone this story, not even my closest friends or family. It's just too bizarre, too unsettling, but it's been weighing on me for years and I feel like I need to get it off my chest. So here goes. It happened when I was 11, just starting middle school. I woke up one morning feeling groggy and disoriented, which was unusual for me. I'm normally a pretty light sleeper, and I always remember my dreams. But that morning, my mind was a blank. As I stumbled out of bed, I noticed a strange sensation on my left calf. It wasn't pain exactly, more like a tightness, a slight pull on the skin. When I looked down, I felt my stomach lurch. There, on the pale skin of my calf, were 3 small, perfectly circular holes. They were arranged in a neat line, each one about the size of a pencil eraser. The skin around them was smooth and unbroken, no blood, no scabs. It looked like someone had just scooped out 3 little pieces of me. I stared at them for a long moment, my mind reeling. Had I done this to myself in my sleep? Was it some kind of bizarre bug bite? I poked at the holes gingerly, half expecting to feel pain, but there was nothing, just a slight numbness. I covered them with a bandage and tried to put it out of my mind. But the next morning, there were 2 more holes forming a small pentagon with the original 3. And the morning after that, a single hole at the center of the pentagon. By this point, I was freaking out. The holes weren't healing, just staying open and clean like they'd been laser cut. I showed my parents, but they just exchanged worried looks and told me not to pick at them. They thought it was some kind of rash or skin condition. But I knew it wasn't. It was too perfect, too deliberate. I started dreading going to sleep, lying awake for hours staring at the ceiling, afraid of what I might wake up to. Then on the 5th morning, I woke up to find the holes gone. Just smooth, unblemished skin, like they'd never been there at all. I almost cried with relief, but that relief was short-lived, because that's when I realized that something else had changed. Math had always been my thing. I loved the logic of it, the satisfaction of solving a tricky problem. I was in advanced classes and I aced every test, but suddenly it was like the numbers had lost all meaning. I'd stare at an equation that should have been simple and feel nothing. No spark of understanding, no intuitive grasp of the concepts. It was like staring at hieroglyphics. I'd rack my brain, but it was just static. My grades plummeted. My teachers were baffled. They thought I wasn't trying, or that I was acting out. I couldn't explain to them that I was trying harder than I'd ever tried at anything. But the part of my brain that understood math, that found joy in it, it was just gone. That was over a decade ago. The holes never came back, and I never found out what caused them. But my relationship with math never recovered. To this day, even basic arithmetic is a struggle. It's like that part of me was just scooped out, like those little circles of skin. I've thought about those holes every day since then. I've scoured the internet for similar stories, for any hint of an explanation. I even worked up the courage to ask my parents about it a few years ago, but they just looked at me blankly. They didn't remember. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but I know I didn't. I can still feel the phantom tightness on my calf, still see those perfect, eerie circles in my mind's eye, and I can still feel the ache of that lost part of myself, the part that understood the language of numbers. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know if it was medical, psychological, or something else entirely, but I do know that it changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. So that's my story, take it for what you will. But if anyone out there has experienced anything similar, please reach out, because I can't help but feel that I'm not alone in this, that there are others out there, walking around with holes in their minds and their memories, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video, also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.